people think that progress is linear, and it actually does not feel linear at the time. It happens in jumps.
A lot of my ideas, when I would spring them on people, they were like, oh, like, that's not a good idea. It's one of the worst ideas I've ever heard in my life.
You turn that search for definition into sort of an engineering problem. So you're not asking, what is this? You're asking, how do I fix it? What do I do with it? I think we may shift our view of the value of human intuition.
You got to be Apollo and Dionysus. You've got to be Plato and Aristotle, or you're missing half of the way of getting insights.
I wake up every day like super energized because I'm like, well, I get to see things that no one else gets to see. And like all the stuff that I've been thinking about for a long time is like, finally I can do it.
The cost of being a heretic today has really plummeted. Well, hello everyone. It's Jim O'Shaughnessy with another Infinite Loops. I was telling my guest just a moment ago that, gosh, this has got to be the first of a series because we have so much in common. We have so much in excitement, but also a little bit of trepidation about the world that we are moving into. My guest is none other than Dan Schipper, the co-founder and CEO of Every, one of my favorite it's not a publication per se, but one of my favorite sources of all things interesting to me. You're also the host of the podcast AI and I. And I can't resist, Dan. I hear my mother's voice in my ear saying AI and me objective case.
I know. But, I could not resist the rhyme.
It works. It totally works. But I think it's so funny. Like, Mom has been dead a long time, but she still squawks in my ear. Like, no,
that's how
Jim,
parents work.
Exactly. So, I'm so excited to talk to you because we share so many of the same interests. But if you don't mind, like every superhero has an origin story. So if you'll give us yours for our listeners and viewers.
And by origin story, are you asking like for more info on Every specifically and that origin story, or just like my origin story as a person? Like where did all this start from?
I am very much interested in your origin story as a person.
Okay, cool. I usually start the origin story stuff at around 5th grade. I read a Bill Gates biography, and I decided I wanted to start a Microsoft competitor, and I was going to name it Megasoft. I actually have the biography somewhere around here in the living room over here, and so I was going to start Megasoft, and so I decided to learn how to code, and I went to Barnes and Noble, and my dad bought me a very expensive book on BASIC. At the time, that was the only way to learn how to code is expensive books, especially if you were in 5th grade, because there are no classes at all for middle school aspiring software entrepreneurs. I had a whole plan for how I was going to do this, which I have in a notebook, which I still have that the list. It's like a list of like my plan, my master plan, and it's like the first one is write soft, which meant write the operating system. And I didn't even complete it with software. Write soft, burn it to CDs, because at that point, the big distribution mechanism was CDs. I was very inspired by the way AOL got distribution by having CDs like everywhere that you could pick up in the grocery store. They put it in your mailbox or whatever. Write soft, burn it to CDs. Put it in mailboxes and then wait. Wait was the last step of my plan. And so, needless to say, I did not end up building an operating system. But I kept programming because I was always very interested in business and always have loved technology. I found that programming was the only way as a middle schooler that I could build interesting businesses, because it was the only way to build a business where the only cost was my time. And so kept programming in middle school, like sort of late middle school, early high school. I got into BlackBerry programming because I noticed that smartphones were starting to become a thing. This is prior to the iPhone. And I had learned from my Bill Gates biography that new hardware platforms were often good opportunities for software. So I started building software for BlackBerry. My most popular software app was called Find It, which was basically Find My iPhone before Find My iPhone came out. So the original version, you could, if you lost your BlackBerry in your house, you could send an email with a special string in the subject line and then have it ring even if it was on silent. And then I eventually iterated that into like a full-fledged web interface where you could track your phone, you could lock it, you could back it up, like all that kind of stuff. Interestingly, that was not a SaaS service. It was a one-time fee because Stripe didn't exist and it was way too hard to create a recurring subscription. So anyway, so that's how I paid for gas and food in high school, is building apps like that. And I would have had a lot more money had Stripe existed back then. And I've been talking for a while, so that's the first chunk of my origin story. In case you want to jump in.
So yeah, I'm my teammates always remind me, Jim, will you stop fucking talking so much on this podcast and let your guests talk? but the whole origin story of how this podcast began was I really wanted it to be kind of like, you're too young to remember the movie My Dinner with Andre. But it was an early movie in like Wallace Shawn, the Inconceivable from Princess Bride. Mm-hmm. It was him and another actor, and literally the entire movie was just their conversation. And it was riveting. Like because a natural conversation that doesn't follow a script, I just find much more interesting.
Yeah.
So, but what's great about that is that you saw very clearly where the world was going, right? And before we started recording, I was showing you some stuff from a 1983 journal when I was 23. And that's what I was writing about. It was literally, computers are going to do this, computers are going to do that. We're going to be able to synthesize. It's going to be a whole new world. And then I had to wait 40 plus years, and here we are. But that's what's cool about it, right? Because you had to adapt to the circumstances at hand, right? It would have been much cooler if Stripe had been around and you could have made it a SaaS recurring revenue business, but that's what happens sometimes with pioneers, right? My more cynical friends tell me that pioneers are the ones that get all the arrows in their back. But I think that pioneers who survive actually have a huge advantage over others because it's already in your mind, right? What it can look like, what the world can look like. That's what I love about your work. And it also kind of leads me into your decision to kind of go. Two of your decisions really resonated with me. The first was stop thinking about yourself as a founder and started thinking what your wording was. You had thought of yourself as a founder who also was a writer, but then you inverted that and you made yourself a writer who was also a founder. I very much resonate with that, having written 4 books, actually in service of the business I was trying to build. But unlike you, I'm more of the Dorothy Parker school, which is I hate writing. I love having written.
I think every writer has a tinge of that. I'm no exception.
Yeah. But I think that that was very cool. But you also, the other thing that I wanted to talk to you about was your decision. You were a little wary about AI, and then you decided, fuck it, I'm going all in, and I reserve the right to jump off this rocket if I don't like what's going on. Uh-huh. So in my notes, I say I have shorthand. Ask Dan about his relationship with AI. It's complicated.
Great. Well, let's take it one at a time. Should I talk about some of the writing stuff first?
Sure.
Cool. Yeah, I think the what you're referring to is I've written two pieces in the last year or so about this. One is called Every's Master Plan, which is sort of like lays out like what Every is and like where we're going and how I'm thinking about it, and also like how I arrived there and some key decisions that went into that. And one of the key decisions is thinking of myself as a writer who is also a founder. And I have a post specifically about that on Every called "Admitting What Is Obvious." Um, and the basic idea of that post and the kind of like thought process for me is there are sometimes truths about yourself that are probably they're obvious in hindsight for sure. They're probably pretty obvious to everyone around you. And they're probably sort of like they're definitely there all the time in your sort of consciousness without you like really even realizing that they're there because the perceived cost of noticing them would be too high for you. And so you don't necessarily allow yourself to really notice it. And so for me, I think wanting to be a writer was one of those truths. And I just like it was very hard for me. Like basically, to go back to my origin story for a second, I originally, before I wanted to be Bill Gates, I wanted to be a writer. This is third grade. And I wanted to write novels. And so I wrote a 100-page novel. And then after I wrote it, I was like, I don't have enough life experience to be a writer yet. So I want to do business stuff. And I'll come back to writing later. And that sort of carried me through to my first company called Firefly, which I started when I was in college. And during that company, I did a lot of writing for it, and that like helped us market the product and all that kind of stuff. And eventually, when I sold it, I spent a couple years like figuring out what I wanted to do, and I again like tried to write a novel. So I was like giving myself some time to like do that. I wrote a couple drafts, but the whole time I was like very conflicted about who am I and like am I going to lose my like founder identity if I go write a novel? And like I had sort of felt the loss of that identity when I sold my first company, and it's just like it's obviously it's one of those amazing things that happens to you, but it's also there's no like manual or process for how to deal with that kind of thing, like selling a company and no longer doing the thing that you do every day. It's very abrupt. And so yeah, like I sort of grappled with that the whole time between companies. And then I feel like I started Every as this sort of way to split the difference to some extent, because like we raised a little bit of money for Every at the beginning, and it sort of looked like a more traditional startup. Like it had always had a media element, but like the way that we pitched it was it's this bundle of newsletters. And so it's sort of like Substack, but we have like, we have an editor and we're going to sort of grow it in this a little bit more centralized way, and everything is bundled under one subscription and all that kind of stuff. So we're able to like turn it into a little bit of a company, or a lot of a company. But the way it originally started is I was just writing a newsletter and it started going really well. And the way I allowed myself to even write the newsletter was I said, okay, I want to start another software company, and I want to do like a Roam, Notion, tools for thought type company. And I need a way to I need a way to do customer interviews with smart people that that like have the kind of note-taking organizational problems that I want to solve, and probably have solved them for themselves so I can understand what they need. And so I was like, I'll start a newsletter. I'll tell people I'm interviewing them for the newsletter. And then I will, like actually write it because I love writing, but I'll use what I learn in order to build a software product that I can then sell to the audience. And I just sort of got stuck for a very long time on the like newsletter part of it, and realized that like it was growing really fast and I really liked it. So we put together a company, we raised a little bit of money, and it was going really well. And as soon as we raised some money, we sort of like I sort of made the decision to like not write as much, because I was like, well, I'm running the company now, so I'll hire writers and whatever. And there was like a sort of 2-year period after that where the growth of it of Every sort of tailed off. Because one of the interesting and difficult things about media is if you start a media company and have a media product that's like written by a person and has their personality in it, if that person stops writing, you lose product market fit. You can still find it again, but like the ability to like consistently produce things of a certain type that people like is like a very rare thing. And so if you have someone like, so I was doing that, and my co-founder Nathan also was doing that. If you have people who are doing that and you switch it, it'll probably take a while to find someone else. And there's no guarantee that the person you find will attract the same audience as you already have. So it just makes media like quite a difficult business. And eventually, after a couple years, I was like, what do I really want to do? Like, why am I doing this? Like, what's my whole like thing with this? And I was just like, I think if I like really take a step back and I didn't consider loss of identity or how I would be perceived, and I didn't really consider um, like financial upside and how I would make money, because like the business was at a point already where like it was supporting me, so didn't have to consider that as much. Like what would be the like the most like the thing in my heart that I would like want to do? And I was like, oh, like obviously like I want to write. And then I was like, I want to write. I want that to be the core thing, but I also like I love business. Like I really like doing all this stuff. Like so I still want to like have a business. And what's really interesting is once I like admitted that thing, which going back to where I began, is the sort of like obvious thing that I hadn't like really admitted to myself. Once I admitted it to myself and sort of flipped that identity to like, I'm a writer who also does business stuff, I immediately found other people who were doing very similar things that I hadn't really noticed before. So a good example that popped up is Sam Harris, who's like primarily a writer, podcaster, who has a meditation app, Waking Up. Another one is Bill Simmons, who great podcaster who has who started The Ringer, he started Grantland. Like all those kinds of people were doing things that are exactly what I wanted to do, but like for a while I hadn't like even really noticed them because they're sort of like off the beaten path of the Silicon Valley like technology like structure of like, you know, raising money and all that kind of stuff. Like they don't fit the mold of a typical VC VC investment. And so I immediately found other people that had sort of done this path. And then I also sort of began to immediately make decisions that like, I guess, changed the reality around me to support this. So I stopped doing meetings in the morning. I was able to hire Kate Lee, who's our editor in chief. She's incredible. She previously was the publisher at Stripe Press. And so that took a lot of the day-to-day media stuff off, media company running stuff off of me. And we did a couple other things like that. And I think most importantly, it allowed me to be like, to myself and everyone else, like writing is the priority. So like, I can't be bothered, like in the morning or whatever. Like I need to have enough time to like get out pieces every week. Cause like, that's the main thing that I'm doing. Whereas previously writing had been a little bit more like a guilty pleasure. But getting to do it all the time created a lot more growth and energy and stuff for every, and for me too, because I think, there's a significant, cost to, not to doing things that you don't really want to do all the time. And so I think for me, like there's this thing where I was like, I feel like I need to act like a traditional CEO of a traditional tech company. And like it just wasn't the thing that I really wanted to do. Like I wanted to be the CEO, but I didn't want to do it in that way. And so as soon as I like kind of, I think, let go of here's how it should be done, and the scales dropped from my eyes a little bit, and just figured out like here's how I think I could do it for me, and this is the way it would work for me. Things just started to accelerate. The business started to get better. I was much happier. I so much am much happier. I started doing much better creative work, which has led to all sorts of things. From, I think my writing is going a lot better. I think we're doing lots of cool creative stuff. We're incubating all these software products. We have a consulting arm. We've got tons of stuff going on. It's like I feel like I'm a kid in a candy store all day. Like it's really, really fun. And I think it sort of starts from that like very like that sort of core decision to like let yourself be who you are and do what you want to do, and like kind of mold your reality around that.
Lots to unpack there. And again, on the similarities, I too wrote a fictional novel when I was 10 or 11. I still have it. It's horrible. It was science fiction, but I got 120 pages. And at some point, maybe our Infinite Books vertical will publish it or a different version of it. One of the questions that I sometimes ask myself that I have found very clarifying, which is this: if I'm looking at like something I might want to do or whatever, I ask myself the question: would I pay to do this? In other words, would I actually pay instead of expecting to be paid to do this? And that there are vanishingly few things that I would pay to do. But like that's how O'Shaughnessy Ventures came into being. Like, yeah, I would because I am paying right now. I prefer to look at it as investing, planting the seed. But the idea like resonated very, very strongly. And back to your master plan. Look, I found, because we also do a lot of seed and somewhat later stage venture investing. And one of the things that I really look for in founders is agility and the ability to pivot and being fine with that, right? Like I'm a huge Walt Whitman fan. I really do believe we all contain multitudes, and trying to like the whole mentality of stay in your lane, just like that doesn't appeal to me at all. Like if you through your actions learn, whoa, wait a minute, like this is probably a really great way to pivot and change. And I like the way you did it too. You put old journals in a large language model and looking for insights, but then you did something very clever that I also do. You had it write future journal entries for you. I use it the same way. And then you got to the way your grand design and plan for every, which you present in a very Maslow-like pyramid, right? With the base being the free stuff, and that's available for millions, and then going up the pyramid. Take us up the pyramid of the master plan.
Yeah. So the way I think about every is sort of like a pyramid. It's hopefully not a pyramid scheme, but it has a little bit of a pyramid structure. So bear with me here.
Okay.
But yeah, at the base of the pyramid is it's like all the content that we make, especially particularly the free content that reaches a lot of people. So we have a newsletter that we publish every day. We publish long form essays about what's next in technology. And then we also have podcasts. So we have a YouTube channel. We have the podcast AI and then in the YouTube channel we publish that podcast and then other videos. So for example, I recently did a video on ChatGPT's advanced voice mode, and that's really cool. So we publish a lot of great stuff, and then above that we have our main offer, and our main offer is the thing that we're trying to sell mostly to people. And that's the Every subscription. It's $20 a month. And as part of the Every subscription, you get access to all the content we publish. So some of the content is paywall. You also get access to discounts on courses that we run. So discounts on stuff you might want. And then we also incubate software products. So we just launched an incubation called Spiral. We can get into that, but it helps you automate a lot of the repetitive creative work that you do every day if you're a founder or a creator. Another one is we incubated this company Lex, which my co-founder Nathan built internally at Every, and then we spun it out, and now it's its own company. And Lex is it's sort of like Google Docs with AI built in, so it's a document editor with AI. We have a couple other incubations in the pipeline, and so as part of the Every subscription, you get access to content and you get access to this like growing library of other products. You can think of it a little bit like Amazon Prime or something like that in that way. And then above that, we sell higher ticket items. So each level of the pyramid is like smaller and smaller numbers of people. So millions of people at the bottom, maybe tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands, maybe more at some point in the sort of every main subscription level of the pyramid. And then above that, we sell courses. So those are like usually $1,500 to $2,000. And those are like B2C courses to our subscribers. Above that, we do a lot of consulting and training type stuff. So, big companies who want to figure out where to integrate AI into their companies and how to train their people. We do a lot of work with companies like that, and that's much higher ticket. And then above that is like speaking or advising, stuff like that, stuff that I need to personally be involved in. That's higher ticket than that, and fewer people. And I think the pyramid concept is interesting because again, it's like this shape of a business that's like totally anathema to like the traditional Silicon Valley way of running a company. Because you got to focus on like your one revenue stream. And this is like, there's four different ones and I didn't even list some of them. Like we have a whole sponsorships business. Like you have sponsorships and then you have subscriptions and then you do consulting and then you do speaking and then you have software. Like what the fuck it would be sort of the like response. And I totally understand that. I think that makes a lot of sense. Um, but I think for media, what I have come to learn is that for one, media is a very difficult business. So you need to have as many revenue streams as you can once you get to a certain point. Like you probably focus for a little while to like get to a certain base, but if you want to grow above that, you need to have different revenue streams. And then you have different members of your audience that have very, very, very different willingness to pay. And if you want to maximize what you can get out of that business, which I think you need to do if you want to do a lot more interesting stuff, you need to figure out how to create different products to reach the different people in your audience who have different needs. And I think this is particularly important because the environment is sort of constantly changing. And so, for example, about, I don't know, like 7 months ago or maybe a year ago, Elon changed the X algorithm to like deprioritize links. And so our traffic went down, right? So, because a big part of our top of funnel was X. And so I had to make a decision that was like, well, what do we do about that? Right. And obviously, like, we should need to find more growth channels. But what I decided to do was for now, we actually had a pretty sizable audience of people who were, running great businesses or famous investors or whatever. And I was like, well, why don't we just focus on bottom of funnel first? We'll expand. We'll take the relationships that we've already built with really interesting people, and we'll expand those relationships by selling consulting or software or training, like that stuff that we can sell. And then we can take that cash and funnel it back into the bottom of the pyramid. And maybe we run ads, or maybe we like hire a growth person or whatever. Like there's lots of stuff to do once you have the cash. And that bet has actually been really good for us. And I think one of the fun things about media is like all this stuff that we're doing, like whether it's consulting or building products or whatever, like these are all announcements that we can make that go viral that actually just help our bottom of funnel, regardless of the eventual success of those businesses. So like everything actually sort of works together in this really nice way. And I think like I actually didn't even have the kind of pyramid structure in my head. I was just like, well, my business is like this crazy like concoction of things. And then I went to this creator retreat run by Tiago Forte, who's an incredible creator and author and course creator. And someone else, his name is Chad Cannon, I think, just drew that on the board as the way he structures his business. And then everyone was like nodding, and then everyone was like, yeah, this is how our business works. And I was like, oh, this is not stupid. Like, this is just a different path that other people take that like I've never heard of because I've been reading too much hacker news, and that was just really, 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 really helpful and clarifying, because I think it's hard to make decisions that sort of go against like what other people around you are doing. And it requires you to like kind of look at reality yourself and be like, what do I see here? And like, what are the like local decisions that I can make that seem to make the most sense, as opposed to like, what did I hear is the right thing to do? Or what was my like original vision for what to do? You need to like kind of be more ground level at like what's actually going on and what do you need to do. And you can arrive at a place that feels like a mess because it's not, no one else around you says like, this is a good idea. But then you might meet other people who are like, actually, no, we found the same thing. And that's just like, oh, you're like, oh, great. This is cool. I'm not crazy. And yeah, so that's the kind of story of the pyramid.
Howard Bloom, who's an author who I think is really underrated because I think he's written a lot of insightful books and everything. He uses the metaphor of when you how you can create a Snelling point, right? Where that it serves as a beacon to find your people, right?
Yeah.
And he uses this great metaphor. If you take a beaker filled with water and you put a bunch of salt in it and you boil it and boil it and boil it, apparently the salt visually disappears. So it looks like just a clear beaker of water. But the cool aspect, and I haven't, full disclosure, I haven't actually done this yet. I really do want to try it to make sure that it actually works. But the metaphor that he uses is you take a single grain of salt and drop it into that beaker, and what happens is all of the salt is attracted to that single grain, and suddenly where you saw only clear liquid, you see this mass of salt. And he says, finding your people works kind of the same way. But he also adds something that I deeply believe. You've got to be really courageous. You've got to be like most of the stuff that I have been able to do and been successful with, like when I would say to somebody, well, I'll give an example. So I decided, okay, the stock market is the Olympics of business. I want to go and see if I can get a gold medal over there. And as I'm thinking about it, I'm like, I suppose that, and remember, this is prehistoric. No internet, no anything really. And so I decided on one of my walks, I have to write a book because I will get the author premium. And right back in the day, if you were going to be an expert on something, you had to have a book. And so I walked in, I was quite excited about that and said to my wife, yeah, so I've decided that the way to really jumpstart this company is for me to write a book. And she's like, okay, Jim, I know you were editor of your high school newspaper, but have you ever written a book? And then I pulled out the one I wrote when I was 10. And I said, yes, look. And she goes, well, yeah, but that's horrible. So A, do you think you really can write a book? And B, you got to get somebody to publish it. And I'm like, details. And the point being that a lot of my ideas that when I would spring them on people, they were like, oh, that's not a good idea. It's one of the worst ideas I've ever heard in my life. And so I started to just kind of build an armor to those kinds of things because I wanted input. I wanted people's feedback because God knows I don't know everything. And no doubt I was quite delusional, thank God. But I would use them to sort of reality test, right? And then I'd think, that's a good idea. And that's why I was intrigued by your use of AI with your own work, your own journals, because I do that all the time. We are in the process of, we call him Sim Jim, and he has not debuted yet, but he's going to be based on 40 plus years of things that I've written. And I joke that I'm going to use the AI to tell me who I am. And that's kind of what you did, right?
Yeah. And before we get into that, I just think that the salt metaphor that you use is really apt, and I think it actually connects quite a bit to the sort of courage idea that you brought up right after that, which is it's not only a good metaphor for finding your people, I think it's also a good metaphor for how progress tends to happen when you're doing anything new, which is people think that progress is linear, and it actually does not feel linear at the time. It happens in jumps. It happens like you see a clear beaker and then you drop a crystal of salt in it and it suddenly all just turns into salt. It's a similar feeling a lot. And I think that's why there's that sort of adage about it takes 10 years to have an overnight success. That is actually what it looks like from the outside, is an overnight success or an overnight whatever. But that's sort of the crystallization of all the salt that's been boiled in the water happening because of one little thing. But that little thing doesn't matter. It's the years of adding salt to the water and boiling it that matters. So to your point about having AI tell you who you are, I think that that's exactly right. It's a joke, but it is also real. I think these tools are incredibly effective at taking in lots of information and reflecting it back to you, reflecting back what they see. And I think for someone like me, being told who I am is like it's incredibly important. It's incredibly valuable. And I think it's useful for everybody, but like for me in particular, for example, like I have a lot of tendencies that make it sort of easy for me to forget who I am. So like a really good example is just this stuff we've been talking about am I right or am I founder, blah, blah, whatever. And sort of subverting the writer identity because the founder identity was like a little bit more prestigious, a little bit more, it felt a little more like I could just say that and people would get it and like all that kind of stuff. And I think there's lots of stuff that's like that about me, but probably about everybody, but me in particular, like I'm just, my sense of self is, I think, a little too sensitive to like what's going on around me. Um, and I think having something that I can kind of like spill my guts to and have it reflect back, like this is what I see, I think helps me create a little bit more of a stable sense of like, no, this is what I'm like, and this is what I want, and whatever. Um, and so using it in that way as a little bit of a mirror, I think is incredibly valuable.
Yeah. And many of the use cases that I got excited about early on. So I go way back and when they still called it machine learning. And, I thought of another essay that you wrote. I had a conversation with a friend who was also a contributor to OSAM. And he loves stock markets, but he was literally a machine language expert. And he had done so well with machine learning, not language, excuse me, that I call him. I'm like, so walk me through this, tell me how it works. I'm really fascinated by this. I think it's kind of the next frontier for quantitative analysis, et cetera. And he said something that resonated because you wrote an essay about this. Yeah. He said, here's what it is, Jim. He said, the human desire to know why something happens is going to be the bottleneck for using AI. He said, Jim, I can build you a system that tells you what, that tells you when, that tells you how, but will not tell you why. And he goes, knowing you as I do, you'll fucking love it. He said, but knowing other humans as I do, they won't. And, I was always kind of driven by Wittgenstein's maxim, don't look for meaning, look for use. Mm. So talk a little bit about that, because I love that essay, resonated strongly with it. But as my friend pointed out to me, it's like, Jim, you are remember Young Frankenstein, Abby Normal? He said, you're kind of Abby Normal. And he said, I think it's like one of the most significant bottlenecks for regular folk who are going to be like, but why? But why? Tell me why.
I love this. You're really speaking my language. I think you're referring to a piece I wrote a while ago called Against Explanations.
Yes.
And the basic idea is that as a society, we're sort of obsessed with finding scientific explanations for things. And we can define a scientific explanation as sort of like, it's causal. It's like if X happens, then Y will happen. So we understand the full system. And we've been obsessed with that probably since the Enlightenment, but probably even we can probably go back to like Plato and the idea of like forms.
Perfect
sort of these
forms,
like
right?
These perfect mathematical constructs that like don't really have physical reality, but like all of physical reality is sort of like a inexact copy of that. And wisdom is about finding the forms, which then you can sort of trace to Aristotle, who was Plato's student, who located the forms not in this sort of like immaterial world, but like as this interplay between like your observations, like what's in the world, and sort of like is contained. The form is sort of contained within them. And Aristotle's outlook, which was a lot more empirical. His father was a doctor. his outlook, I think, filters into just the sort of the scientific method, right? And you can see that in Darwin and Galileo and all these sorts of figures, Newton, that precipitated the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, which has been incredible for us, right? Um, but I think what's really interesting about that revolution, which is based on, based on a lot of the stuff that happened in the Enlightenment, like Newton's discovery of the laws of gravity, we've been trying to make all of our sort of any endeavor that makes progress, we try to think of as being like that. Like we were trying to reduce it to something like calculus, or the laws of gravity, where we can say it's a little equation. If X happens, then Y happens. And I think that's been successful to some degree. But as we've levered up into more complex fields like biology, psychology, social science, economics, all that kind of stuff, we found that it's actually quite difficult to do that. And we've been trying for a really, really long time. And I think, you can look at a field like psychology and be like, well, the reason why there's all this p hacking and all this kind of stuff is like psychologists aren't good enough scientists. And if we just tried harder and had better methods, we would be able to reduce it down into a, something like a calculus. But I think my feeling is that we are, we are drunk on explanations. We're really trying to find explanations, and we're really drunk on our idea of ourselves as rational animals, and that being rational, having intellectual understanding of something, which again comes back to Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, that's like the highest form of human existence. And so if you don't really understand it, you don't have an explanation for it, then it's not good enough. And to be clear, I think that got us really far. But I think the reason why there's so much emphasis on rational explanation, scientific explanation, causal explanation is, before, I don't know, a couple years ago, in order to make good predictions about the world, we needed to have causal explanations. So the good thing about calculus is you can calculate the trajectory of a cannonball pretty easily. And so we've been looking for explanations because we think that that's what we need to do in order to make predictions, especially predictions that are inspectable, that can be transferred from one person to another. Like a great thing about an explanation is I can explain it to you and then you can use it and you can do the calculation yourself. They're checkable, all that kind of stuff. And what's really interesting about AI is it's the first time that we've had something other than a human that can make predictions that are unbundled from explanations. So we don't need the explanation anymore in order to make the prediction. And so and immediately what a scientist will say is, well, that's correlation, it's not causation. And I'm just like, fuck it. Let's do correlations first. And so I think that the correlation or the ability to make predictions without explanations that you can get from machine learning or AI is really important, because I think it can help us make progress in areas of study like psychology that progress has been really, really hard to come by without it. So, we've been studying the brain and human psychology for at least 150 years since Freud, and we still don't really know what depression is or anxiety or all this stuff, right? We don't have a scientific explanation for it. And I think what's really cool about deciding to do away with explanations, at least for the time being, is that you can turn a search for search for a definition of depression, which again goes back to Plato, or Socrates. You turn that search for a definition into sort of an engineering problem. So you're not asking what is this, which is a scientific question. You're asking how do I fix it, or what do I do with it, which is an engineering problem. And you can solve that latter question by being able to predict it. So instead of knowing what depression is, we can just predict who's going to get it and which treatments are going to work for them. And so one thing that's really interesting is you can start to help people immediately. So I think that's really important. And the other interesting thing is that I think I think that if you have a good enough predictor for a phenomenon like depression, there will probably be some sort of explanation in your neural net. Um, and what's interesting about that is I think neural nets are like a little bit more interpretable than human brains are. So um, we may be able to like find a explanation for depression, for example, in a neural net that predicts it rather than like studying the brain. But I think to like sort of bring this all full circle, I think what we will find is probably the explanation for depression or something like that, some complicated higher level topic like that, is not is so big that it's not open to rational analysis. It's like it's too big to fit in our rational brains. But what's really interesting is I think that anyone who's had an interaction with a really, really good clinician knows that some people have just like an intuitive idea of like what's going on with someone and how to fix it that like other people don't. And it's just like them building up this like intuition that they can't even explain, but it's like in there, right? And I think because of this whole thing that started with like Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, we've really like jettisoned our reliance on our intuition and said like intuition is like sort of bad, to some degree, and we should be finding these explanations. Um, and and that's for a lot of reasons, right? Like when you use intuition, which is really about correlation, like you're open you start to believe in spirits or ghosts or whatever, like non-empirical things, right? And the emphasis on rationality allowed us to create provable explanations that could be transferred between people, which allows for better collaboration, which helps us make progress. And what I think is interesting about AI is building AI models that work a lot like human intuition in that they can make predictions without explanations. Those AI models have a lot of the properties of explanations, so they are transferable, they are inspectable and debuggable. And so they take this innate human thing, intuition, and then they put it out into like a machine that can replicate it to some degree. And so I think we may shift our view of the value of human intuition because we suddenly have machines that can replicate it and that can have it be transferred from person to person and help us make progress. And so I think like what we should be doing is de-emphasizing our search for causal explanations, our emphasis on rationality, and instead re-emphasizing our view of human intuition and the ability of machine learning and AI models to replicate its best properties and use it to make progress.
That's why I started this chat with this is going to be a series, because like literally we could do an entire show on this because I completely agree with you. And you got to remember, I owe my career to being, a Spock, right? Being totally analytical, replicatable models that if you ran the same back test on something, you would get exactly the same results as I got. And as I did it, I became very aware of the fact that my dad and I love philosophy. He loved philosophy. And so he was a Platonist. And so I decided, well, I'm going to be an Aristotelian. and so, but as we would have great talks, really. And they were really educational because like I would bring up a point, he'd like, oh, that's one I haven't thought about. But then he'd come up with a good example. And it really led me to this idea that really you've got to unite. You've got to be Apollo and Dionysus. You've got to be Plato and Aristotle. Okay. Or you're missing half of the way of getting insights.
Yeah.
And like I often say that one of our greatest challenges is that for the most part, most of us are deterministic thinkers living in a probabilistic world, and generally hilarity or tragedy ensue.
Yeah.
And so one of the things as I go back through my old writing and my new writing is like, it was always acknowledging that, but I was really suppressing it because I wanted just the facts. Nope, we've got to make sure that, we know what the cause is, we know what the
Yeah.
general outcome is. And then I did a conversation with Rupert Sheldrake, who I think is one of the most brilliant scientists working today. And yet, to the materialist citadel, he is the heretic of all heretics, because that's what he's espousing, right? He's saying, and you know what? These 10 laws of science, he has a great TED talk, and where he just demolishes them all. But what we started talking about on our chat was this idea, intuition, and how do we test it, right? Like, I look at intuition as, look, when I've had a long career in finance, for example, and when you see the same pattern time and time and time and time again, you get this saturated or imbued intuition. And it's something you're really not aware of at the conscious level, but you are incredibly aware of it at the intuitive level. It's like in 2006, I was marching around saying to anyone who would listen, if you can short your house, short your house. Like, real estate is going to be a debacle. And then they'd say, why? And I'd say, I've seen this play time and time and time and time again. And so we're actually in the beginning stages of trying to work on an intuition app with Dr. Sheldrake, in which we would make it fun. And the object of the app would be to A, see how good your intuition is. B, if it is pretty good, can we improve it? But then C, Dr. Sheldrake is willing to do it, a scientific method test on it. And what I love about him is, if he comes up with a null set, he publishes. He's like, well, I thought that this could happen, but didn't bear itself out. And so I'm just a huge fan of giving the multiplicity of models, right? That's one of the reasons why I love AI so much. And one of the things you talk a lot about is we're moving from a knowledge economy to an allocation economy. And in an allocation economy, again, we are so aligned, it's scary. I might try to hire you before the end of this, or maybe I'll just buy everything.
We can talk about it.
But like, are things that are really difficult to quantify, right? Good taste. I have been saying for several years now that if you have good taste and you're a good curator, man, is the world going to be your oyster. Because I think that what's going to happen, especially with AI, is we're going to see a tsunami of AI-only generated content. And I think that the beginning of that, it's going to suck. It's not going to be great because it's going to lack the human spark. Now, do I think it could get and will get better? Yeah, I do. But I think that for now, I'm a huge believer in kind of the Centaur model, human plus machine, making for the best. And my, Brian Romelli, who's a friend, he says we shouldn't call it artificial intelligence. We should call it intelligence amplification. And that's one of the things that I like, and you advocate for in the allocation society or economy, excuse me. Tell us a little bit about how you came to seeing that switch from the knowledge economy to the allocation economy.
Yeah, I guess I was just observing my own patterns in both using AI and running a company. And I use AI all the time for writing, for programming, for decision making. And I realized when I was trying to figure out like what's a good metaphor for what it is like to use a model a lot, I realized it just reminded me a lot of interactions that I have with people that I work with as a manager. And then a lot of the skills of being a manager. So a really, really good one is when to delegate and when to micromanage or like look over their shoulder. Like that's a skill that every manager, every beginning manager has to learn how to do, and everyone fucks it up. I've been cursing a lot. I don't know why. Something about this interview is
It's
just
me.
I'm freewheeling.
I'm a bad influence because somebody I had Senra. I don't know whether you follow him.
I do, yeah.
So I had him on the podcast, and we're friends. And
He's great.
Patrick, my son, has him as part of his Colossus network. And David, the first thing he said was, "Jim, is this a cursing podcast?" I went, "Fuck yeah!" And he was like, he just was so relieved.
That's great. I'll have
So-
to text him and let him know that I followed his lead and I dropped a couple F-bombs on your show.
Yeah, but he still is the king. He's dropped more F-bombs than any other guest.
I can't compete. I definitely cannot compete. So going back to sort of the manager idea, and this sort of like delegation versus micromanaging, it's a thing that every manager has to learn. I struggled with it. I still struggle with it to some degree. And every time I watch someone at Every become a manager, I see the same thing. I realized that a lot of the same things are happening with people when they use models. So they'll be like, well, I delegated X task to it and it came back and it didn't do a good job. Or, well, in order to get it to do a good job, I have to like tell it every single step. And I'm basically just doing the work for it. And so I realized, like, oh yeah, this is like it's a very overlapping problem with the problem that managers have. And what's interesting about the skill of being a manager is that it's not very broadly distributed. I think there's like, I have some stat in that piece and I can't remember, but it's like single digits of Americans are managers. And that's because currently it's like very expensive to like hire people. And so there's only a few people who get that opportunity to learn how to hire and run a team. And I think probably what one outcome of the AI age or whatever age we're in is those same skills will become much more broadly distributed because the same skills will be used for not for human management but for being a model manager. And models are going to be much cheaper and much more broadly available. And so I started to think about like, okay, like what happens in a world like that. And so I was like, well, it might mean that the way that you are compensated and what skills are valued are those sort of like management skills. So it's like when to delegate, when to micromanage, or your taste or your vision or your ability to break a task up into its smallest components and then know which resources to delegate each part of the task to, like all that kind of stuff. And so I was like, well, in that case, like maybe we're sort of entering an allocation economy where you're compensated based on your ability to allocate intelligence. And that's sort of where it came from.
Yeah. And one of the things that when I started O'Shaughnessy Ventures, like one of my North Stars was we are gonna imbue AI into every aspect of everything we do. And it's really interesting because I got on certain things resistance that I really was not anticipating. And so, for example, I think that AI, since AI is really good at creating characters, right? And so, like, for example, we have Infinite Books. It's a publishing company. Now, we're going to have AI do a lot of the drudge work that currently is a bottleneck at other publishers, like simple things like, when you send your manuscript in and you're really eager to see what it looks like as a book, right? They're supposed to typeset it like it will look as a book. And if you've written a book, that reading it that way, you're like, oh my God, I didn't even see this, or this. And as the author is very eager for that, in a traditional having done 4 books, it takes a long time between when you give them that manuscript and when you get it back in a different format with hopefully some typos found and some other editorial choices. Well, with AI, we'll have it back to you the next day. And so, but another thing I thought was, you know what? Like, and I love to see that you referenced it. Dumas with the Three Musketeers used a writing team. And I was super bullish on this idea of, like every TV show, every movie, they all have writers' rooms. It's not a single author. And one of the things that I wanted was let's create an AI writer's room. I love history. So I particularly like the way Will and Ariel Durant write their books. Why don't I just download everything that Will and Ariel Durant have ever written and create an AI Will or Ariel Durant, not to write it, but to work with me, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm a big believer. I've always believed that I was at best a co-creator, right?
Mm-hmm.
The universe and the muses and everything else, you got to give them credit, right? Because you're co-creating. But when I pitch this to a lot of authors, they're like, never, I will, and that's an abomination. And so I don't think like that at all. And so I put a lot of my ideas into AI and I say, show me my weaknesses. I did it with some of yours with a large language model.
Yeah.
And so what I put in was, I put in your idea that that we're moving to an allocation economy.
Yeah.
And so I did this with a commercially available ChatGPT from OpenAI, so anybody can do it. And I said, so tell me, is this argument weak? And it came back with, yes, when you simply say knowledge orchestration is the most important bottleneck, the AI came back to me and said, the statement is very broad and lacks specifics as to why. And then I said, okay. And then it goes, maybe data quality is the biggest bottleneck. Maybe computational power is the biggest bottleneck. And then like I do with my own stuff, I said, oh, cool. So take what you've just criticized and give me the improvement. And it did. And so it goes, okay. So I think that what we should do is have concrete examples. And then it started listing them for me. Yeah. And it's like healthcare. Our case study will be IBM Watson for oncology. What was the issue? It struggled to deliver good diagnostic guides. It was not accurate in terms of predicting cancer. Solution, enhancing the knowledge orchestration. And then it gave all of the examples by giving the framework of clinical guidelines, real world data, all of this. And then it goes, this suggests that it really is knowledge orchestration. Because then it addressed each of the ones that it had said it could have been. Was it the data integrity issue? Was it this? And then it's like, no. But then it just kept going. And it gave financial services, JP Morgan, but it took it through everything. And I just do that by rote these days, right? Like every idea I have, I throw it into, well, we have our own internal AI stack. But you can do it with any of these. Why do you think that people are reluctant? Why do you think that like, I just look at this as, God damn it, this is the coolest tool in the world.
I mean, I obviously feel the same way. I spend my whole life playing with this stuff. And I was honestly doing something so similar today. Like I was reading, one of the reasons why all this like Greek stuff is on my mind is because I've just been on a Greek kick. And because I'm writing a whole like kind of piece that's tracing the philosophical emphasis on explanations and all that kind of stuff. So as part of research for that piece, I'm reading this book called The Trial of Socrates by I.F. Stone. And
oh yeah, good book.
Yeah, you know it? Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's really cool because like Socrates is this like he's a intellectual hero. He's a martyr for reason, right? He's like the base of Western culture in a lot of important ways. And I.F. Stone but the Athenians executed him. And usually, like if you read Plato, you're like, well, obviously the Athenians are stupid. Like, why would they do that? And I.F. Stone is like, no, like he was kind of an asshole. Like he sort of deserved it a little bit. You know, he was pretty anti-democratic in a lot of his pupils were the ones that like led the overthrow of democracy a couple different times in Athens prior to his execution. And Athens was like remarkably tolerant of a lot of his anti-democratic ideas until, you know, a couple of revolutions or oligarchic takeovers of Athens sort of led them to be a little bit more like sensitive about it. Um, and so anyway, so I was reading that, and what's really fun is I have the new ChatGPT advanced voice mode, and I just like opened it up, put it on the table. And as I was reading, you know, I was like asking questions. I was like, who is this person? Like, tell me the background. Give me a little background. And then I go back to reading. And then B, like, I think what's funny is I think the usual like Platonic or Western case for Socrates is pretty biased. And I think I.F. Stone, like, is biased in the exact opposite direction, which is kind of funny. Like, it's not balanced. He's just like, Socrates sucks. And so he would say something in the book, and I'd be like, I'm kind of curious, like, what's the other side of it? And so I would just ask, like, yeah, what's the counter argument here? And it just gave me a really, really good counter argument. And then I was looking for like a more balanced perspective. And one thing that I find is like kind of interesting is thinking about someone like Socrates. Like, you either villainize him or you kind of knight him or think of him as a little bit of a saint, and you kind of glorify the his emphasis on rationality, on sort of an internal idea of right and wrong that kind of both led him to found Western philosophy and probably led to his execution. Um, but I think when you look at it that way, you sort of dehumanize someone like him. And it's really interesting to think of Socrates as a human and to think of him in psychological terms. And so I was like, okay, pretend you're like an expert clinical psychologist and you're examining Socrates. Like, how would you talk about him? Use clinical terms. And so it started talking about, yeah, like he has this like deep internal locus of control. He has extremely high standards. He has like a sort of a rigid thinking style that can't accommodate like a social pressure from outside or any sort of social control over him, and put possibly his emphasis on like Socratic irony or Socratic questioning is like a defense mechanism against, like, he has such a strong idea of what is right that he has to pretend like he doesn't know anything so that and ask questions so that he doesn't like piss people off, but then he pisses them off anyway. Anyway, it was like fascinating. It was amazing. I loved it. It was so cool. And it felt like, yeah, a little bit of this like co-created discovery of like a new view of Socrates that I think is actually true and interesting and valuable. And so I think these tools are like incredibly helpful for that, and kind of make me feel like I have superpowers. And as to why people are afraid, I mean, I think there's many different answers for many different people. Um, I do think writers in particular have this real attachment to like their words and their thoughts and nothing interfering with that. I think like you and I might be a little bit more open to it. I think we're just sort of like early adopter nerd type people. But B, if you run a company, you're a little bit more used to the idea that like even if you didn't do every single part of this, it still can be yours, or you know, you get to put your name on it to some degree. And so I think we're a little bit more used to that. It's maybe a similar kind of managerial skill or experience where it's like we did this all together. And also like it came from me. Like you both can be true in certain ways. And I think people who haven't had that experience may be a little bit more sensitive to the idea that they're kind of giving up something really, really important by allowing something else into their process. But I think that the actual like the more balanced view of creative work is that like there's tons and tons of contributors to any given creative work. And it's never the precious thing where you like went up on the mountaintop and you were uninfluenced by anything. You were like sitting in an isolation tank and you were uninfluenced by anything. Like it's just not how it works. And I think we can debate the relative pros and cons or strengths or weaknesses of different influences on creative work. But I think it's sort of inarguable that for a certain kind of creative work, for a certain kind of person, like language models are like uniquely effective and empowering. And I think there will be a new generation of creatives that use it to build stuff, and there will be new social norms around them. Like right now, it's sort of like, I don't know, it's like a little bit shameful, especially in certain circles, to admit that you use it for writing, or it's like a little bit. It feels a little weird to like talk to ChatGPT if you're in a room with other people. Like all that stuff is like weird. I don't think it'll be weird in 10 years or 20 years or whatever. Like I think people forget and don't know that 100 years ago, maybe a little more than 120 years ago ish, listening to music alone was considered weird, because music was a communal social activity. And so, you made it together with people around you. And so listening to a recording of it was like, it was a lot of similar feelings as people feel like, listening to AI generated music or reading AI generated text. Like it's shameful. It's missing some core element. And I think what the core element that's actually missing is, we have this whole sediment of experience and memory and culture that have grown up around like the idea of recorded music, that allows us to connect with it in this very deep way. And language models like have none of that. And so I think people like us are drawn to them because they're new and interesting, and we like that stuff. But they're missing the like sediment. And the sediment is rich and important, and it's amazing. And I think we tend to sort of mistakenly think all these things are like frozen in time and will always be the way that they are. And the reality is that like the sediment is going to build up, and in 30 years or 40 years, like we're going to like look at today as like the golden age of like when language models were like so cool and so open, and so like there's so much stuff that they're doing right now that forevermore they will never be so innocent. It's like the golden age of cinema was like, at the beginning of it before it turned into like a Hollywood big mega machine or whatever. Like we're right there with AI stuff if you're willing to pay attention to it. And I think that the mores and the social value of it will change, but it'll take a generation.
Yeah, I think that have you read Joseph Heinrich's book, The Weirdest People in the World?
Yes, I love that book. It is literally sitting right in front of me.
Me too. And one of the things that the really good points I think he makes is that we have cumulative aggregate cultural evolution, and it stands outside of normal evolution. And it actually does change our physical characteristics. He makes the point that literate people, their brains are literally shaped differently. What happens with highly literate people is the ability to be literate colonizes the area that was given to visual acuity. And when you take a film of an illiterate's brain versus a highly literate person, they're literally different shapes.
Yeah.
And the idea is very consistent with what you just said. Unless you are like really into it, you're going to need the aggregate cumulative cultural evolution to happen before you're like, oh, okay, yeah, that's fine. And I think it's everywhere, by the way, right? Like who are some of the artists that modern people think are the greatest artists of all time, right? Probably a lot of impressionists in there, Vincent van Gogh in there, etc. But when they came about, like everyone hated them.
Yeah.
They were like, and in fact, their name was given them as a term of derision, right? That looks like a child figure painting, right? The little impressions, right? And so like Van Gogh sold one painting during his own lifetime, and now he's considered the greatest artist of all time. And that fluidity, I think, a lot of it is due to the need for cumulative cultural evolution. And if one of your edges is that you can see that shit a lot sooner than other people, that's a really nice edge to have, because like it's almost invaluable. And if you are, I and it that is not meant in any way to diminish people who don't like look at the world that way. I think Bucky Fuller had this great idea, which is don't bang on people because they're not tuned in yet. If you're tuned in earlier, be happy about that. But remember, you're probably wrong. I always remind myself, I'm probably wrong. I'm probably wrong. But like being tuned in, if you are like really into something like you and I are into AI, of course you're going to be a little more tuned in because you're like all over it. And the example that Fuller gave was the microscopic world. Before we invented microscopes, we had no idea that there was this entire other world there. And then I can never say the guy's name, Leeuwenhoek,
Van Leeuwenhoek, I think. I don't know.
Thank you. And he's looking through it and he's like, holy shit. He got tuned in, but then how long did it take other people to get tuned in? It took decades.
Totally.
And so I think that one of the changes is we're getting tuned in faster than we used to, but there's still a huge lag. And in that lag lay massive opportunities. Agree?
I totally agree. And that's one of the things that I feel so lucky to do is like, it doesn't necessarily take so much smartness to like, see this in the world in this way. It's just like, I just get to live it because I'm like interested in it. Right. And like a lot of this stuff are very simple, like projections out from my own experience. Like to some degree, like, because I have ChatGPT advanced voice mode, I get to like live a couple weeks or months ahead of other people, which is crazy. But because I sort of have been using this stuff and use it a lot every day, there are a lot of people who it will take them a couple years or maybe more to do the same thing. And so I get to see a little bit further ahead. And obviously like that doesn't mean I'm like some kind of like genius or whatever, and or like prophet or whatever. And it doesn't mean that other perspectives are not valid. Like I think there's a lot of AI skepticism that's warranted. I think like in general the discourse kind of goes from everything is amazing and it's going to be AGI to like we're all going to die. And I think both are wrong. And different people with different personalities, like everyone has a sort of place in the world. It's good to have people who are a little bit more conservative and aren't like jumping onto the next thing all the time and are like stalwarts of society and like all that kind of stuff. It's great. But yeah, I think I wake up every day like super, super energized because I'm like, holy shit, like I get to see things that no one else gets to see. And like, I'm like, all the stuff that I've been thinking about for a long time is like, finally I can do it. And like, and I'm lucky enough to be in a position where I like have the time and the energy and the money and the team and the skills or whatever to like take advantage. And so I'm just like trying to do it as much as I can. And it's super fun. I love it.
Same with me, and exact same feeling, right? It's like, I sometimes get short-tempered with people in my family that I love, like my wife, for example. She like was one of the original AI haters. She's an artist. She's a photographer. And so I decided that I was going to just kind of slow walk it with her. And then I finally, like, I was just like triumphant the other night when she's like, we're having dinner and she's like, hey, could like your models give me examples of what I could maybe improve in my photography? And I'm like, yes, they can, honey. But they're not going to change it, right? I'm like, not if you don't want it to. If you don't want it to, they won't change anything, but they can give you all sorts of suggestions.
Yeah.
And then she's kind of like, okay, would you install that for me on my computer? And I'm like, yes, yes. But I
That's
have
great.
found that that is a better way to approach it, right? Like I'm crazy, and like I'm one of the things that I'm also happy about is like the cost of being a heretic today has really plummeted, right? In the old days, for most of human history, if you were like not in the lane of society,
Yeah.
boom, your head gets chopped off, you get burned at the stake, you get, the authorities are like, heretic, kill him, burn him. And now we get our own podcast. and the worst thing that could happen is people are like, Shaughnessy, what a fucking idiot that guy is. And
I love
so
it. Yeah.
yeah, and so my method is just to be like, hey, you might like this. Just give it a look see, and not to push, right? Because like you're never going to convince anyone that. Here's a great example. Like I personally believe we're caring for my wife's 97-year-old mother. She's still got all of her marbles.
That's amazing.
She's an amazing human. I want to interview her and like put it on the podcast because like literally somebody born in 1920 whatever,
Right.
and what she's seen in her life and everything. But one of the other things that I see, like we have her living here with us, and she had to go to a rehab facility after she got COVID. And Dan, I got to tell you, when I went to visit her, I was fucking horrified because there were all of these elderly people literally unattended in their rooms. And it was the saddest thing that I had seen in quite a while. And like literally walking down to her room, there was this poor woman in her room basically just repeating, would somebody please help me? Would somebody please help me? And like my heart got broken. And so immediately I started thinking, well, what about an AI use case that would be like literally a companion, like somebody that they could talk with? And then maybe we could emulate their children, their grandchildren. And the reaction that I got from people that I thought would find that like an exciting idea, they kind of looked at me and like, you monster.
Yeah.
You want a machine to take care of them? And I'm like, okay, well, what's better? Leave them in their room alone, shouting, will somebody please help me? Will somebody please help me? Or giving them a companion. And then they're like, they get all Plato perfect form. Well, no, that should be the family in there with them. And I'm like, well, yeah, there's a huge difference between should and ought and real, right? The fact is, the family isn't going and doing that. And as idealized as that might be, that ain't happening.
Yeah.
So why are you objecting to the ability to at least give these people some kind of comfort? But the pushback, oh my God, they looked at me like I was Satan himself.
Yeah, I felt that too from a lot of people. And I think that there is something to the like, there's like the tech bro kind of like caricature archetype that's like, I'm gonna fix everything and like whatever, and obviously like that's not great,
Right.
But I think that there's this other thing going on the other side, which is that there's a sort of moral judgment aspect to new things, which I think sometimes gets in the way of the pragmatic, like, is this going to help or not? And I think being able to factor that out, like the moral, it's like almost disgust element, the moral disgust reaction, will open up a lot of these types of things. Like it is, when people think about I don't know, AI boyfriend girlfriend type things, it's the same kind of like disgust feeling. But what people sort of forget is there are a lot of people out there who have real problems communicating verbally in real time in person with people, and chatbots are like the first time that they can like actually have like what feel like real social interactions and like practice their social skills and have people have something that like kind of gets them and can and is patient enough to like be with them in the way that they want someone to be with them. And you can't argue with me that like, oh, it's not real, like they should just be sitting in the room alone or whatever, or they should like get out there or whatever. It's like, no, 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 this is like super helpful for people that need it. And yeah, I think like it's probably a bad idea to create chatbots that are designed to like take people and get them sitting in their room, you know, not interacting with other people and being addicted to it, and you know, whatever. Like, there's probably some ethical line, but I think it's incredibly valuable. Even for me, I have plenty of friends, and I have family that I love, and I have a girlfriend, and like whatever. Like, I have plenty of social interaction, but like just having that thing to talk to where I'm like, I'm reading a book. Can we talk about it? Like, I don't have people that I can talk to like that really as about all the different things I'm into. I have people for certain things but sometimes they're not available, you know, and it is actually like a deeply like life enriching thing if it's used correctly. And I think, I feel very lucky to A, live in that time, and then B, yeah, like I do a lot of that like gentle pushing with people around me, or hopefully in the writing that I do or the podcast that I record or whatever, to, you know, like, because going back to the example of your wife, like photography, for example, is faced this very same thing when it first came around, right? People very suspicious that it's going to unemploy painters, and it doesn't take any skill to like just look through a lens and press a button. And it's like, turns out actually it takes a lot of skill. But we don't think of it as like a new technology or a technology at all because it's been around for so long. Same thing for writing books or whatever, like same exact thing. And I think you can talk about that, but my experience is generally some people resonate with an argument like that, but mostly it's like kind of it doesn't really resonate. But like what I just do is I'm like, you should try Claude for that, and then they're like, no. And then I keep kind of doing it, and eventually like they're like, oh, interesting, this is kind of cool, and I'm like, yeah. uh, and that's sort of what the show I do is about too, because I think what I try to do is interview people where we're not just talking about it, like we're actually going through and looking at their exact use cases. So like, what are some historical chats you've done with XYZ model? And then we actually use it together. And I think that's a really great way to like give people the like, uh, allow people to put themselves in the place for like, oh, I can see how I would use it because I can see how someone else is doing it. Where I think talking about it in the abstract, it's such a general purpose tool that people have a hard time like connecting with it. And so, yeah, the more people just see other people doing it and get to try it for themselves in specific ways that are helpful for them, I think the better.
Could not agree more, Dan. And as I said in the beginning, I'm getting my hook here because we're at the 90-minute mark. I hope that this is the first in a series of chats between you and me about AI, the good and the bad, right? So, like, I am not Panglossian about this at all. Like, I understand that we're going to create a whole new set of problems. Hopefully, they're going to be better problems, and hopefully, the AI will help us solve those problems. But we didn't get into any of the downsides, of which there are many. But it's kind of like the quote from, I can't remember whose line it is, but it's a great quote. It's like, we invented fire, and guess what? Or we discovered fire, better way of putting it. Fire is really dangerous. But it's also like the reason for our prefrontal cortex, when we started cooking our food, that's what created this executive up here. Mm-hmm. And so instead of banning fire, we had fire departments, fire alarms, fire extinguishers, firemen and women, you know, fire retardants, etc. So, like, instead of like, the only kind of argument that I have a really hard time with is the folks that I dub the lunatic fringe. Like, we'll leave names out of it, but a certain someone calling for strikes on GPU facilities, I think, does not advance the conversation.
I agree.
But I think that I'm very unwilling to talk about the challenges because there'll be a lot. But like, this has been absolutely fabulous. It's like I'm very excited because I can't wait for the next time I talk to you.
Me too.
But in the interim, first off, tell everyone where they can find you. I know where you can find you. Early every subscriber. But tell our audience where they can find you, and then I got a final question for you.
All right. So you can find us at every.to and subscribe there. I'm also on X at Dan Shipper, and you can also subscribe to my podcast, AI and I, on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. So wherever you get your podcasts.
Perfecto. All right. You're going to get more than one bite at this apple. If you've heard any of our other podcasts, you know that at the end, we make you the emperor of the world, and that you can't kill anyone. You can't put anyone in a re-education camp. You can't write the book, The Republic, because you're a reactionary and you lost the Peloponnesian War. But what you can do is we're going to give you a magic microphone, and you can say two things into it. And the two things that you say are going to incept the entire population of the planet. The next day, they're going to wake up, whatever their next day is. They're going to wake up and they're going to say, man, I just had two of the best ideas. And unlike all the other times, I'm going to act on both of these ideas today. What are you going to incept in the world's population?
This is interesting. I did not prepare for this. But the two things that came to my head first were be curious and be kind.
I love both of those. Wow. The world would be such a better place if those were the two things that animated the entire population. Because, the final thing I'll say is that, everyone says that the only constant is change. I used to really entirely embrace that until I read this kind of crazy philosopher who I'm looking for his name. Yeah, I actually wrote it down because I forgot. Bertrand Kitzler, who wrote a book on consciousness, and he made a great point. And he was like, no, for human beings, the ultimate aim is growth. And then he goes through all of the things like everything else in the universe grows until it reaches its potential. He uses plants and trees and all of that. And he goes, but we can't physically grow or we topple over. What is the one thing where we can have unlimited, infinite growth? Our minds. And so I'm a huge believer that curiosity is what leads to that growth, and kindness. And there's a huge difference between someone who is kind and someone who is nice. I come from Minnesota, and they have this thing, Minnesota Nice. And when I was going back there, I was like, welcome back. I turned to my wife and I said, welcome back to the land of false sincerity and pretend nice. But there is a huge difference between being nice and kind. I endeavor and try to be kind. I'm not particularly nice, though. So this has been absolutely great. I'm going to have my nanny, also known as my executive assistant, who literally tells me what I'm going to be doing the next day. I have no idea. I get an email from her every night, and I'm like, oh, that's tomorrow. That's awesome. I've been looking forward to talking to Dan the whole time. But thank you so much. I love everything you're doing, and I can't wait for our next conversation.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, and I feel the same way. I'm excited to do it again.
Terrific. Thanks, Dan.